Chapter 23, Part 5 of Volume 3 of A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Volume 3 of A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. Chapter 23. The 100 Years' War. Charles VI and the Dukes of Burgundy, Part 5. It had just been reported that the Duke of Burgundy had completely beaten and reduced to submission the insurgent Liegese, and that he was preparing to return to Paris with his army. Great was the consternation amongst the council of the queen and princes. They feared above everything to see the king and the dauphin in the Duke of Burgundy's power, and it was decided to quit Paris, which had always testified a favorable disposition towards Duke John. Charles VI was the first to depart, on the 3rd of November, 1408. The queen, the dauphin, and the princes followed him 2 days afterwards, and at Gien they all took boat on the Loire to go to Tours. The Duke of Burgundy, on his arrival at Paris, on the 28th of November, found not a soul belonging to the royal family or the court, and he felt a moment's embarrassment. Even his audacity and lack of scruple did not go to the extent of doing without the king altogether, or even of dispensing with having him for a tool, and he had seen too much of the Parisian populace not to know how precarious and fickle was its favour. He determined to negotiate with the king's party, and for that purpose he sent his brother-in-law, the Count of Hainault, to Tours, with a brilliant train of unarmed attendants, bidden to make themselves agreeable and not to fight. A recent event had probably much to do with his decision. His most indomitable foe, she to whom the king and his councillors had lately granted a portion of the vengeance she was seeking to take on him, Valentine of Milan, Duchess of Orleans, died on the 4th of December, 1408, at Blois, far from satisfied with the moral reparations she had obtained in her enemy's absence, and clearly foreseeing that against the Duke of Burgundy, flushed with victory and present in person, she would obtain nothing of what she had asked. For spirits of the best mettle, and especially for a woman's heart, impotent passion is a heavy burden to bear, and Valentine Visconti, beautiful, amiable, and unhappy even in her best days through the fault of the husband she loved, sank under this trial. At the close of her life she had taken for device, "Naught have I more, more hold I not. Bien ne m'est plus, plus ne m'est rien." And so fully was that her habitual feeling she had the words inscribed upon the black tapestry of her chamber. In her last hours she had by her side her 3 sons and her daughter, but there was another still whom she remembered. She sent for a child 6 years of age, John, a natural son of her husband by Marietta d'Enghien, wife of Sire Canet Dunois. "This one," said she, "was filched from me, yet there is not a child so well cut out as he to avenge his father's death." 25 years later John was the famous bastard of Orleans, Count Dunois, Charles VII's lieutenant general, and Joan of Arc's comrade in the work of saving the French kingship and France. The Duke of Burgundy's negotiations at Tours were not fruitless. The result was, that on the 9th of March, 1409, a treaty was concluded and an interview effected at Chartres, between the duke on one side, and on the other the king, the queen, the dauphin, all the royal family, the councillors of the town, the young Duke of Orleans, his brother, and 100 knights of their house, all met together to hear the king declare that he pardoned the Duke of Burgundy. The duke prayed my lord of Orleans and my lords his brothers to banish from their hearts all hatred and vengeance, and the princes of Orleans assented to what the king commanded them, and forgave their cousin the Duke of Burgundy everything entirely. On the way back from Chartres the Duke of Burgundy's fool kept playing with a church paten, called peace, and thrusting it under his cloak, saying, "See, this is a cloak of peace;" and "many folks," says Juvenal des Ursins, "considered this fool pretty wise." The Duke of Burgundy had a good reason, however, for seeking this outward reconciliation; it put an end to a position too extended not to become pretty soon untenable; the peace was a cause of great joy at Paris; the king was not long coming back; and 200,000 persons, says the chronicle, went out to meet him, shouting "Noel." The Duke of Burgundy had gone out to receive him, and the queen and the princes arrived 2 days afterwards. It was not known at the time, though it was perhaps the most serious result of the negotiation, that a secret understanding had been established between John the Fearless and Isabel of Bavaria. The queen, as false as she was dissolute, had seen that the duke might be of service to her on occasion if she served him in her turn, and they had added the falsehood of their undivulged arrangement to that of the general reconciliation. But falsehood does not extinguish the facts it attempts to disguise. The hostility between the houses of Orleans and Burgundy could not fail to survive the Treaty of Chartres, and cause search to be made for a man to head the struggle so soon as it could be recommenced. The hour and the man were not long waited for. In the very year of the treaty, Charles of Orleans, eldest son of the murdered duke and Valentine of Milan, lost his wife, Isabel of France, daughter of Charles VI.; and as early as the following year, 1410, the princes, his uncles, made him marry Bonnie d'Armagnac, daughter of Count Bernard d'Armagnac, one of the most powerful, most able, and most ambitious lords of southern France. Forthwith, in concert with the Duke of Berry, the Duke of Brittany, and several other lords, Count Bernard put himself at the head of the Orleans party, and prepared to proceed against the Duke of Burgundy in the cause of dominion combined with vengeance. From 1410 to 1415 France was a prey to civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians, and to their alternate successes and reverses brought about by the unscrupulous employment of the most odious and desperate means. The Burgundians had generally the advantage in the struggle, for Paris was chiefly the centre of it, and their influence was predominant there. Their principal allies there were the butchers, the boldest and most ambitious corporation in the city. For a long time the butcher trade of Paris had been in the hands of a score of families; the number had been repeatedly reduced, and at the opening of the 15th century 3 families, the Lagoy, the St. Yon, and the Thibert, had exercised absolute mastery in the market district, which in turn exercised mastery over nearly the whole city. One Caboche, a flayer of beasts in the shambles of Hotel Dieu, and Master John de Troyes, a surgeon with a talent for speaking, were their most active associates. Their company consisted of apprentice butchers, medical students, skinners, tailors, and every kind of lewd fellows. When anybody caused their displeasure, they said, "Here's an Armagnac," and dispatched him on the spot, and plundered his house, or dragged him off to prison to pay dear for his release. The rich burgesses lived in fear and peril. More than 300 of them went off to Melun with the provost of tradesmen, who could no longer answer for the tranquillity of the city. The Armagnacs, in spite of their general inferiority, sometimes got the upper hand, and did not then behave with much more discretion than the others. They committed the mistake of asking aid from the King of England, promising him the immediate surrender of all the castles, cities, and bailiwicks they still possessed in Guienne and Poitou. Their correspondence fell into the hands of the Burgundians, and the Duke of Burgundy showed the king himself a letter stating that the Duke of Berry, the Duke of Orleans, and the Duke of Bourbon had lately conspired together at Bourges for the destruction of the king, the kingdom, and the good city of Paris. "Ah!" cried the poor king with tears, "we quite see their wickedness, and we do conjure you, who are of our own blood, to aid and advise us against them." The duke and his partisans, kneeling on one knee, promised the king all the assistance possible with their persons and their property. The civil war was passionately carried on. The Burgundians went and besieged Bourges. The siege continued a long while without success. Some of the besiegers grew weary of it. Negotiations were opened with the besieged. An interview took place before the walls between the Duke of Berry and the Duke of Burgundy. "Nephew," said the former, "I have acted ill, and you still worse. It is for us to try and maintain the kingdom in peace and prosperity." "I will be no obstacle, uncle," answered Duke John. Peace was made. It was stipulated that the Duke of Berry and the Armagnac lords should give up all alliance with the English, and all confederacy against the Duke of Burgundy, who, on his side, should give up any that he might have formed against them. An engagement was entered into mutually to render aid, service, and obedience to the king against his foe of England, and they were bound by right and reason to do; and lastly, a promise was made to observe the articles of the peace of Chartres, and to swear them over again. There was a special prohibition against using, for the future, the words Armagnacs and Burgundians, or any other term reflecting upon either party. The pacification was solemnly celebrated at Auxerre, on the 22d of August, 1412; and on the 29th of September following, the dauphin once more entered Paris, with the Duke of Burgundy at his side. The king, queen, and Duke of Berry arrived a few days afterwards. The people gave a hearty reception to them, even to the Armagnacs, well known as such, in their train; but the butchers and the men of their faction murmured loudly, and treated the peace as treason. Outside, it was little more than nominal; the Count of Armagnac remained under arms and the Duke of Orleans held aloof from Paris. A violent ferment again began there. The butchers continued to hold the mastery. The Duke of Burgundy, all the while finding them very much in the way, did not cease to pay court to them. Many of his knights were highly displeased at seeing themselves mixed up with such fellows. The honest burgesses began to be less frightened at the threats and more angry at the excesses of the butchers. The advocate general, Juvenal des Ursins, had several times called without being received at the Hotel d'Artois; but one night the Duke of Burgundy sent for him, and asked him what he thought of the position. "My lord," said the magistrate, "do not persist in always maintaining that you did well to have the Duke of Orleans slain; enough mischief has come of it to make you agree that you were wrong. It is not to your honor to let yourself be guided by flayers of beasts and a lot of lewd fellows. I can guarantee that 100 burgesses of Paris, of the highest character, would undertake to attend you everywhere, and do whatever you should bid them, and even lend you money if you wanted it." The duke listened patiently, but answered that he had done no wrong in the case of the Duke of Orleans, and would never confess that he had. "As to the fellows of whom you speak," said he, "I know my business." Juvenal returned home without much belief in the duke's firmness. He himself, full of courage as he was, durst not yet declare himself openly. The thought of all this occupied his mind incessantly, sleeping and waking. One night, when he had fallen asleep towards morning, it seemed to him that a voice kept saying, "Surgite cum sediteris, qui manducatis panem doloris." "Rise up from your sitting, ye who eat the bread of sorrow." When he awoke, his wife, a good and pious woman, said to him, "My dear, this morning I heard some one saying to you, or heard you pronounce in a dream, some words that I have often read in my hours;" and she repeated them to him. "My dear," answered Juvenal, "we have 11 children, and consequently great cause to pray God to grant us peace. Let us hope in Him, and He will help." He often saw the Duke of Berry. "Well, Juvenal," the old prince would say to him, "shall this last forever? Shall we be forever under the sway of these lewd fellows?" "My lord," Juvenal would answer, "hope we in God yet a little while, and we shall see them confounded and destroyed." Nor was Juvenal mistaken. The opposition to the yoke of the Burgundians was daily becoming more and more earnest and general. The butchers attempted to stem the current, but the carpenters took sides against them, saying, "We will see which are the stronger in Paris, the hewers of wood or the fellers of oxen." The Parliament, the Exchequer Chamber, and the Hotel de Ville demanded peace, and the shouts of "Peace, peace!" resounded in the streets. A great crowd of people assembled on the Greve, and thither the butchers came with their company of about 1,200 persons, it is said. They began to speak against peace, but could not get a hearing. "Let those who are for it go to the right," shouted a voice, "and those who are against it to the left." But the adversaries of peace durst not risk this test. The Duke of Burgundy could not help seeing that he was declining rapidly; he was no longer summoned to the king's council; a watch was kept upon his house, and he determined to go away. On the 23d of August, 1413, without a word said, even to his household, he went away to the wood of Vincennes, prevailing on the king to go hawking with him. There was a suspicion that the duke meant to carry off the king. Juvenal des Ursins, with a company of armed burgesses, hurried off to Vincennes, and going straight to the king, said, "Sir, come away to Paris; it is too hot to be out." The king turned to go back to the city. The Duke of Burgundy was angry, saying that the king was going a hawking. "You would take him too far," returned Juvenal; "your people are in travelling dress, and you have your trumpeters with you." The duke took leave of the king, said business required his presence in Flanders, and went off as fast as he could. When it was known that he had gone, there was a feeling of regret and disquietude amongst the sensible and sober burgesses at Paris. What they wanted was peace, and in order to have it the adherence of the Duke of Burgundy was indispensable. Whilst he was present, there might be hope of winning him or forcing him over to it; but whilst he was absent, headstrong as he was known to be, a renewal of war was the most probable contingency. And this result appeared certain when it was seen how the princes hostile to the Duke of Burgundy, above all Duke Charles of Orleans, the Count of Armagnac, and their partisans, hastened back to Paris, and resumed their ascendency with the king and in his council. The dauphin, Louis, Duke of Aquitaine, united himself by the ties of close friendship with the Duke of Orleans, and prevailed upon him to give up the mourning he had worn since his father's murder. The two princes appeared everywhere dressed alike. The scarf of Armagnac replaced that of Burgundy; the feelings of the populace changed as the fashion of the court; and when children sang in the streets the song but lately in vogue, "Burgundy's Duke, God give thee joy," they were struck and hurled to the ground. Facts were before long in accordance with appearances. After a few pretences of arrangement, the Duke of Burgundy took up arms and marched on Paris. Charles VI., on his side, annulled, in the presence of the Parliament, all acts adverse to the Duke of Orleans and his adherents; and the king, the queen, and the dauphin bound themselves by oath not to treat with the Duke of Burgundy until they had destroyed his power. At the end of March, 1414, the king's army was set in motion; Compiegne, Soissons, and Beaufort, which held out for the Duke of Burgundy, were successively taken by assault or surrendered; the royal troops treated the people as vanquished rebels; and the four great communes of Flanders sent a deputation to the king to make protestations of their respect and an attempt to arrange matters between their lord and his suzerain. Animosity was still too lively and too recent in the king's camp to admit of satisfaction with a victory as yet incomplete. On the 28th of July began the siege of Arras, but after 5 weeks the besiegers had made no impression. An epidemic came upon them; the Duke of Bavaria and the constable, Charles d'Albret, were attacked by it; weariness set in on both sides; the Duke of Burgundy himself began to be anxious about his position, and he sent the Duke of Brabant, his brother, and the Countess of Hainault, his sister, to the king and the dauphin, with more submissive words than he had hitherto deigned to utter. The Countess of Hainault, pleading the ties of family and royal interests, managed to give the dauphin a bias towards peace; and the dauphin in his turn worked upon the mind of the king, who was becoming more and more feeble and accessible to the most opposite impressions. It was in vain that the most intimate friends of the Duke of Orleans tried to keep the king steadfast in his wrath from night to morning. One day, while he was still in bed, one of them softly approaching and putting his hand under the coverlet, said, plucking him by the foot, "My lord, are you asleep?" "No, cousin," answered the king; "you are quite welcome. Is there anything new?" "No, sir; only that your people report that if you would assault Arras there would be good hope of effecting an entry. But if my cousin of Burgundy listens to reason, and puts the town into my hands without assault, we will make peace." "What! sir, you would make peace with this wicked, this disloyal man who so cruelly had your brother slain?" "But all was forgiven with the consent of my nephew of Orleans," said the king mournfully. "Alas! sir, you will never see that brother again." "Let me be, cousin," said the king impatiently; "I shall see him again on the day of judgment." Notwithstanding this stubborn way of working up the irreconcilable enmities which caused divisions in the royal family, peace was decided upon and concluded at Arras, on the 4th of September, 1414, on conditions as vague as ever, which really put no end to the causes of civil war, but permitted the king on the one hand and the Duke of Burgundy on the other to call themselves and to wear an appearance of being reconciled. A serious event which happened abroad at that time was heavily felt in France, reawakened the spirit of nationality, and opened the eyes of all parties a little to the necessity of suspending their own selfish disagreements. Henry IV., King of England, died on the 20th of March, 1413. Having been chiefly occupied with the difficulties of his own government at home, he, without renouncing the war with France, had not prosecuted it vigorously, and had kept it in suspense or adjournment by a repetition of truces. Henry V., his son and successor, a young prince of 25, active, ambitious, able, and popular, gave, from the very moment of his accession, signs of having bolder views, which were not long coming to maturity, in respect of his relations with France. The Duke of Burgundy had undoubtedly anticipated them; for as soon as he was cognizant of Henry IV.'s death, he made overtures in London for the marriage of his daughter Catherine with the new King of England, and he received at Bruges an English embassy on the subject. When this was known at Paris, the council of Charles VI. Sent to the Duke of Burgundy, Sire de Dampierre, and the Bishop of Evreux, bearing letters to him from the king, which forbade him, on pain of forfeiture and treason, to enter into any treaty with the King of England, either for his daughter's marriage or for any other cause. But the views of Henry V. soared higher than a marriage with the daughter of the Duke of Burgundy. It was to the hand of the King of France's daughter, herself also named Catherine, that he made pretension, flattering himself that he would find in this union aid and support of his pretences to the crown of France. These pretences he put forward, hardly a year after his accession to the throne, basing them, as Edward III. Had done, on the alleged right of Isabel of France, wife of Edward II., to succeed King John. No reply was vouchsafed from Paris to this demand. Only the Princess Catherine, who was but 13, was presented to the envoys of the King of England, and she struck them as being tall and beautiful. A month later, in August 1414, Henry V. gave Charles VI. To understand that he would be content with a strict execution of the Treaty of Bretigny, with the addition of Normandy, Anjou, and Maine, and the hand of the Princess Catherine with a dowry of 2,000,000 crowns. The war between Charles VI. And John the Fearless caused a suspension of all negotiations on this subject; but after the peace of Arras, in January 1415, a new and solemn embassy from England arrived at Paris, and the late proposals were again brought forward. The ambassadors had a magnificent reception; splendid presents and entertainments were given them, but no answer was made to their demands. They were only told that the King of France was about to send an embassy to the King of England. It did not set out before the 27th of the following April. The Archbishop of Bourges, the most eloquent prelate in the council, was its spokesman, and it had orders to offer the King of England the hand of Princess Catherine, with a dowry of 840,000 golden crowns, besides 15 towns in Aquitaine and the seneschalty of Limoges. Henry V. rejected these offers, declaring that, if he did not get Normandy and all the districts ceded by the Treaty of Bretigny, he would have recourse to war to recover a crown which belonged to him. To this arrogant language the Archbishop of Bourges replied, "O king, what canst thou be thinking of, that thou wouldst fain thus oust the King of the French, our lord, the most noble and excellent of Christian kings, from the throne of so powerful a kingdom? Thinkest thou that it is for the fear of thee and of the English that he hath made thee an offer of his daughter together with so great a sum and a portion of his land? Nay, verily, he was moved by pity and the love of peace; he would not that the innocent blood should be spilt and Christian people destroyed in the hurly-burly of battle. He will invoke the aid of God Almighty, of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and of all the saints. Then by his own arms and those of his loyal subjects, vassals, and allies, thou wilt be driven from his kingdom, and, peradventure, meet with death or capture." Chapter 23. Part 5.